So Francis David's story didn't actually end with the Edict of Torda. Like so many reformers, he didn't get to live happily ever after. In 1571, just a few years after the Edict of Torda, King John died in an accident, leaving no heir to the throne. The next king of Transylvania was Stephen Bathory, a Catholic. King Stephen did reaffirm the Edict of Religious Toleration, but he declared that there was to be no further religious innovation. That was it. The changes in religion had gone far enough, thought King Stephen. He didn't feel the need to punish what had already happened, but also didn't want to let it get any further. Nonetheless, Unitarianism thrived in Transylvania during that time, gaining many converts and eventually creating a church structure. And Francis David soon rose to the top of that structure, becoming the bishop of the Unitarians. They had bishops back then. And Francis David, as you might not be surprised to hear, had no interest in stopping his religious innovation. Despite being the bishop, he was much more interested in reforming church doctrine than he was in creating church structures. And he explored a variety of theological questions, including infant baptism, predestination, the Eucharist, and the worship of Jesus. In each case, he questioned official church doctrine. And Francis David wasn't one to keep his ideas quiet. He began to preach his new ideas from the pulpit, despite warnings from other church leaders. Francis David kept preaching what this was now heresy, even after he was ordered to stop by the prince. And so, as happened in that day, he was arrested for the crime of religious innovation, the crime of questioning church doctrine and practice and exploring new ideas. Francis David was tried and was found guilty of innovation, a conviction that sent him to prison for the rest of his life. He didn't live long after this sentence and died in prison in 1579. Now, looking at our faith today, it's not surprising at all that one of the earliest accusations levied against a Unitarian was that of religious innovation. We are, after all, a tradition that declares that revelation is not sealed, that we are always learning more, and that there is always more wisdom to be found. The idea of being done with innovation, of shutting the door on anything new, feels like a heresy to me, more than a bunch of other things. Now, Francis David's story and so many others throughout our history tell the story of a faith that was founded on innovation and that has stayed alive through all these years, in large part because of our willingness to keep on innovating, keep on learning, keep on adapting to the times. If there's one thing that Unitarians, Universalists, and Unitarian Universalists have been known for throughout history, it is trying on new ideas and ways of being. Now, of course, this doesn't mean that any of this innovation happens without a fight. Francis David is not the only one who has been told, okay, time to stop with all the new things. Each generation has brought its own new ideas and had its own tensions with the previous generation. One of my favorite examples of this phenomenon are the Transcendentalists. They were basically the second generation of Unitarians in the United States, most active in the 1830s and 1840s. Their parents' generation had founded Unitarianism in the United States, using their close reading of the Bible to preach about a loving God, a more human Jesus, and the human goal of living more fully into our likeness to God. They valued reason and rationality above all else. Sound familiar? And then, yeah, it does sound familiar, right? And then the Transcendentalists came along, as so often is the case, and you may know some of them by name. Henry David Thoreau, Ralph Waldo Emerson, Margaret Fuller, Theodore Parker. The Transcendentalists were deeply influenced by literary romanticism, Hindu texts like the Upanishads, and German idealism. They believed in the inherent goodness of people and of nature, and trusted in intuition far more than reason, or the teachings of their elders. They built on the theologies that the previous generation had espoused, but they didn't have much good to say about that generation. In a now famous graduation address at Harvard Divinity School, Ralph Waldo Emerson preached against the corpse-cold Unitarian preachers, whom he believed relied far too much on rationality and could stand to bring a little emotion to their ministry. Now, this address became famous because the preachers that he called corpse cold were the ones in the audience. The Transcendentalists longed for more of a spiritual experience in their religion than the first generation of Unitarians had to offer. And at the same time, that first generation of Unitarians looked at the Transcendentalists and thought that they were too emotional, and sometimes questioned their sanity. Now, looking back, it's easy for us to see that Transcendentalism built on Unitarianism through the values of freedom of conscience, the idea of a loving God, the optimism about what humans were capable of. But for some early Unitarians, the Transcendentalists were just too much. They were, like Francis David, guilty of innovation, of continuing to question and probe, continuing to call for their tradition to change with the times, with the emergence of new wisdom. So often it seems that it is one generation of innovators who most vehemently object to the next generation of innovators. We like change when it is our idea, but we're not so sure about it when someone else starts to question what it is that we've come up with. I'm sure you've experienced this in your life. You've come up with some system or some idea and you think, this is so much better than what we had before, right? And you feel pride in what you've created. And then someone comes along and begins to question it, to wonder how it could be made even better. They ask, why do we believe this? Why do we do things this way? And it hurts your pride because you worked hard to get there. I imagine that this is how people in Transylvania who called for religious innovation to cease felt when people like Francis David kept on questioning and changing the doctrine. Haven't we worked hard to get here? Isn't this good? I imagine that it's how the first generation of Unitarians felt when those Transcendentalists accused them of being corpse cold. I imagine that it's how some of you have felt who have been in this church for a long time, each time some new idea is proposed. We put our heart and soul into creating a faith and an institution that matter, that offer something important to this world. We pour our time and energy into building a church community that we can feel good about. And then inevitably, someone comes along and starts questioning it all. I see this happening now with the questions that people of color are asking our faith about the way it has been and continues to be complicit in white supremacy culture. There are things about Unitarian Universalism that we cherish that are being called into question. There's music that we love to sing that we've now started to realize is perhaps not appropriate for a majority white congregation to sing. And there's our deep devotion to individualism that's being called into question. We're being asked if that's really what's best for our faith and our world. And perhaps more than anything else, there is a questioning of the vision that we have of ourselves as a welcoming and inclusive faith. We hear stories of people of color coming to UU congregations and no one acknowledging their existence. We hear about UU professionals of color struggling to get jobs or being pushed out of churches. And sometimes when these stories are told, we hear about UUs of color receiving threatening, hateful notes from fellow Unitarian Universalists who would rather they kept their mouths shut. All of these stories paint a picture of our faith that does not look particularly welcoming or inclusive. They call into question this whole narrative that we have been telling about ourselves. They offer a different truth about who we are and how we exist in the world. And this can be a hard truth to hear. I know it's hard for me. Perhaps it's as hard as your worship being called corpse cold. Perhaps it's as hard as being told that the Eucharist, the most important ritual of your faith, is not what you thought. When we're in the midst of it, it's hard to take that long view, to see this as our next step in what later may look like the logical evolution of our faith. Looking back, it is much easier to see how each piece of our story fits with the one before and the one after. We can tell that cohesive narrative. And it's easier to appreciate how each stop on the journey led us to where we are today. Memory is much kinder to the innovators of the past than it is to the innovators of the present. This is not to say that every innovation is good, right? We know that. Or that we should just go along unquestioningly with each new thing that comes around. Our choir just sang for us the words of our fourth principle, which speak to the free and responsible search for truth and meaning. And it's so important that that freedom in our search is combined with the responsibility to really look closely at new things as they come along. There have been plenty of innovations in our history that were not the best idea, and some that we're pretty embarrassed about looking back. The Transcendentalists, for example, sometimes took their ideas a little too far. They are well known for trying and failing many times to create utopian living situations. I've told the story before about Bronson Alcott's Fruitlands experiment. It was a small farm community that failed the first winter when they had spent a little bit too much time philosophizing and not enough time making sure there was food stocked up for the cold winter months. Henry David Thoreau famously wrote about his time living in a one-room cabin by Walden Pond, a stay that lasted 2 years, 2 months, and 2 days. While there's a lot of great writing that came out of that time, One might say that Thoreau was taking the individualism inherent in transcendentalism a little bit too far. How was his removal of himself from society really benefiting anyone but himself? What kind of model was he actually setting? Despite these and many other questionable innovations from our history, for the most part, our history of innovation has had positive impacts on our faith and our world, at least more positive than just staying put. We were the first denomination to ordain women all the way back in the 1860s. We were at the forefront of the civil rights movement, the women's rights movement, and the fight for LGBTQ rights and equality. And we have become a faith today that is open to people from many different religious backgrounds. None of that would have happened if we had ignored the innovators in our midst. We are a religion of innovators, a tradition that believes that revelation is not sealed, that there are always new truths to be found. We are constantly challenging ourselves and each other to try new things and to try on new ideas, to ask those hard questions and to speak up about hard truths. Now, this doesn't always make Unitarian Universalism an easy religion to be a part of. And not all of our innovations are perfect the first time around, but our willingness to innovate, our willingness to change as the world changes, is one of our greatest strengths. We are always learning, always growing, always seeking new ways to spread love. May we continue to be open to new wisdom, hard truths, and the ongoing evolution of our faith.
Search for truth.